No spin, no bias, no censorship. I'm Dan Wootton. This is Outspoken Live, episode number 19, on a day of shame for the BBC. As the face of its news operation for decades, the man who announced the death of the Queen pleads guilty to child sex offences. And breaking right now, new details from the BBC about what they knew and why they didn't act. And why did MSM figures like Maitlis, Jon Sopel and Owen Jones defend Edwards while trying to cancel me? A special digest coming up on that. Also on the way today, why are leftists and the MSM more disgusted by the deplorable scenes of violence in Southport last night than the stabbing of 11 young girls? We'll have the conversation that the rest of the MSM is studiously avoiding with my superstar panel, Alan Miller and Alex Story. Then, Father Calvin Robinson on Hugh Edwards, Stockport, and the glorious moment Carol Vorderman realised live on LBC today that she'd backed a dud by campaigning for this dishonest new socialist Labour government. I can't wait to share that with you. And remember to sign up for our uncancelled after show, which you can register to watch on our own website at www.outspoken.live. Father Calvin will be joining me for the full half hour today with the sort of analysis that you don't get on big tech platforms. The uncancelled after show is a safe space, free of censorship. And your support at just £5 a month not only gives you 30 minutes of extra content every single weekday, it also allows us to continue making this independent daily news show. Let's go. In 2 decades of shame for the British Bashing Corporation that has a sick history of protecting child sex fiends, including Jimmy Savile, this was still a jaw-dropping moment. BBC News cut away from breaking news from Israel to make a mortifying announcement of their own. Their top news host for decades, the man entrusted with delivering election results and announcing the death of the late Queen, had just made an astonishing guilty plea in a London courtroom. Huw Edwards had admitted to having sexual images of boys as young as 7 on his phone, and within half an hour was facing up to 10 years in prison. The cover-up corporation could no longer ignore the news.
Breaking news here on the BBC. Within the past few minutes, former BBC News presenter Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty at Westminster Magistrates Court to 3 counts of making indecent images of children. He arrived just under an hour ago. The offences took place between 2020 and 2022. They relate to 37 images that were shared on a WhatsApp chat, according to the Metropolitan Police. So in the past few minutes, the broadcaster, former BBC presenter Huw Edwards, has pleaded guilty at Westminster Magistrates Court to 3 counts of making indecent images of children.
Lee Anderson was pilloried last year for describing the BBC as, quote, a safe haven for perverts. But look at the rap sheet. Jonathan King, convicted of sexual offences between 1983 and 1987 against 5 boys aged 14 and 15. Original Radio 1 host Chris Denning, jailed for 18 months for gross indecency with a child, and in 1988 for 3 years for indecent assault on a 13-year-old boy and possession of indecent photographs. The thick of it actor Chris Langham, sentenced to 10 months in prison after being found guilty of downloading 15 child abuse images and videos. It's a knockout presenter Stuart Hall, imprisoned for 30 months for 2 offences of indecent assault against a girl of 13 and another against a girl under 16. Rolf Harris, 5 years and 9 months after he was convicted of 12 charges of indecent assault against 4 girls, including one aged 7. Not to mention the 450 young people believed to be assaulted by the BBC's biggest star and most prolific pedo, Jimmy Savile. And when it came to Huw Edwards, they were warned but didn't act. In fact, we have learned in the last few minutes that the BBC knew Huw Edwards had been arrested but did not report the news. Another cover-up. Now, around the same time as the first Edwards allegations became public, a deranged left-wing witch hunt by people like Emily Maitlis and Owen Jones began against me. It was based on provable lies that I'm not going to give credence to here, and then exacerbated when Laurence Fox said he wouldn't shag the female journalist Ava Santina on my former GB News show. The hysteria, you probably know, led to me losing my career in the MSM. But it was a political hit job, pure and simple, and I have since been entirely cleared after multiple spurious investigations. Now, isn't it funny that those same people trying to destroy me were the ones defending their establishment BFF, Huw Edwards? Here was newsagent host Emily Maitlis.
The Sun has now rowed back from this implication of criminality in their coverage. They literally said on their newspaper that the top BBC star who paid child for sex pictures could be charged by cops and face years in prison. That is a Sun headline. If that doesn't suggest criminality,
I said could be.
Does?
They didn't say it would be. They were trying to put. I mean, of course, you're absolutely right. That is exactly the implication. That is exactly what they are pointing.
And they had
towards.
a denial from the young person, their so-called child, and they chose not to run the denial. Do you think there's a way back to the BBC for Huw?
Yes,
a career.
I do think that. I think in order for that to happen, lots of things have to go his way. But the country is not the Sun.
There's been radio silence from Emily Maitlis today. Here's more from her co-host, Jon Sopel, who has been equally silent.
We now know there was no illegality. So what are you left with? Someone's private life has come under scrutiny, who is now unwell. I think it would be a crying shame if this is the last we see of Huw Edwards on television, when the allegations have turned out to be not that much.
He even tweeted, "This is an awful episode where there was no criminality but perhaps a complicated private life." That doesn't feel very private now. I hope that will give some cause to reflect. They really need to. I wish Huw Edwards well. The always wrong Lewis Goodall added, "The questions for the Sun just got bigger still." No wonder their podcast is now known as the Fake News Agents. Bit of former Sun editor David Yelland, who you saw there, also wrote on X, "I wish Huw Edwards well. The Sun inflicted terror on Huw despite no evidence of any criminal offence. This is no longer a BBC crisis. It is a crisis for the paper. Huw's privacy must now be respected. Social media also needs speedy reform." But as usual, it was left to the reprehensible Owen Jones to launch the most strident attack. He wrote on X, "The Sun is a disgusting rag and they have to pay for what they've done to Huw Edwards. They tried to destroy someone's life with false claims of illegality involving a minor. We know now there was no criminality. And the Sun have driven a vulnerable man into medical care." Now, I always thought that was very ironic at the time, given that Owen Jones was the worst at amplifying all the lies around me, simply because I disagree with him politically. He didn't give a damn then about due process, but I will give him credit, at least today he has come clean, unlike Maitlis and Sopel. He's written on X, "Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty to illegal pictures of indecent pictures of children. In other words, pictures of child abuse. This is a vile crime. This is, as the Metropolitan Police say, completely separate from other claims, which is what I tweeted about last year. Given the deranged level of death threats and general homophobic bile I'm receiving, I realise there's probably little point stating the truth, but the truth matters. Hugh Edwards has pleaded guilty to a serious crime today. This is separate from last year's allegations. And by the way, those objecting to the Sun's coverage last year were not comfortable with Hugh Edwards' behaviour, but that's different from illegality or the Sun appointing itself the nation's moral arbiter. Hugh Edwards is rightly disgraced by what he has admitted today. Now look, what we know is that the BBC is a disgrace to Britain. It should be immediately defunded because it is time that we start again. But just remember that when it came to both the Jimmy Savile scandal and the Hugh Edwards scandal, the BBC and the wider political establishment and the MSM tried to look after their own, despite obvious criminality. Thank God the days of the legacy media are numbered. But to react now, let me bring in today's superstar panel. And I'm delighted to be joined by the co-founder of the wonderful Together Declaration, Alan Miller, and the former Olympic rower, how appropriate this week, and Conservative Party candidate, not to mention top political commentator, Alex Story. Wow, great to have you both here. Huge day of news again. But Alex Story, we're learning quite a lot of new information right now from the BBC about Hugh Edwards. What's most shocking is that they knew he'd been arrested last November, but decided not to report it?
Yeah, it seems to me. But the first thing I'd say is thanks, Dan, for taking me out of my holiday.
I'm sorry about that.
To report on scoundrels like the BBC and Sopel and Maitlis and all of that. But it seems to me to be par for the course for the BBC, just to brush under the carpet the things that it deems unpalatable and emphasize the things that it really backs. And we see that on the Hugh Edwards story, but we see that on the riots, we see that at the Olympic Games, we see that all the time. We see that on the streets of London when Jews are being attacked in the streets, but when pro-Palestinians are given a free hand by the police. All of that is essentially what the BBC does constantly. So it's not a surprise to me. What it does do, though, is that it puts in questions everything that we've known from the BBC, or we've learned through the BBC across the ages. And that, for me, is the key question. What is it that we've learned from the BBC over the last decades that is not a lie?
I know. And they are very good at covering things up. I mean, Alan Miller, look, this is an interesting one because obviously there has to be due process when allegations are made. But clearly there's a real hypocrisy where a lot of folk decided to row in behind Hugh Edwards because he's their man.
Yeah, I think the thing is that there does have to be due process, and people can get a bit trigger happy, but it is astonishing the extent to which some commentators have decided to rally round Hugh Edwards and say, there's nothing there now, let's get him back into the position, it was all kind of libelous. And yet we've had silence now. Well, it remains to be seen what comments are made subsequently now, but it does strike me that it's really concerning that both at the time and now, some people are saying the way to deal with these things is to limit and suffocate social media and other platforms. Somehow ordinary everyday people can't be trusted with the truth and honesty and reality, but the great and the good can. The great and the good, of course, who want to tell us we've got this climate catastrophe, and anyone that asks questions is a denier. That also with the BBC senior staff colluding with Sadiq Khan and telling all of their executives in BBC News and BBC South not to discuss ULEZ, a direct line to Sadiq Khan, as well as smearing ordinary citizens and calling them far-right and conspiracists when they were actually challenging ULEZ. All of this reflects a kind of stance and a particular outlook that isn't about the news, isn't about objective fact reporting, but it's much more about taking positions on all sorts of issues, on whether you sex-based rights, whether that's to do with the environment. And of course, if you're the right type of person, one of our guys, then perhaps you're going to get far less scrutiny. It's going to look like it's a witch hunt, but then everyone else seems to be fair game. So it seems wholly inappropriate. And I think that the public are getting very fed up with it, Dan. I think the public is thinking to themselves, this is not an objective overview of things. This is very much a narrative-led situation where things are presented in a certain way. And that together, we've certainly been very acutely aware of this, and also to raise the attention of that with the public and to get them to actually comment, to write in, to off-comment to the BBC and actually try and have our voices heard. But as you say, that's another reason why MSM and the legacy media are feeling such a pinch. I mean, a lot of people have become very cynical about what they're seeing and hearing.
Well, indeed. And I guess, Alex, when you look at everything that Alan has just outlined, what the BBC now tries to set themselves as is the moral arbiter. And yet, where's their morality? They seem to be a completely corrupt company when it comes to the way they deal with scandals. So isn't it utterly ludicrous that we should ever listen to the BBC again when it's trying to preach to us about how to do things correctly, or when it's trying to hold other organisations to account? Haven't they lost all credibility now?
Yeah, I mean, it comes, I think, from a state of mind in which they believe that they are a superior caste. And that's, I think, an extremely is an extremely important point to try and take on board. Once you start to see yourself as a superior caste, you give yourself privileges that you don't grant to others. That's where we are. The only reason why we are able to see this as clearly as we do today is because of social media, because we can interact outside of the channels of mainstream media. The reason why the establishment looks so fragile, and in my view, the reason why it's overreacting in the way that it's doing at the moment, is because they're in competition that they're losing. In the 1950s and 60s, it was much easier for the establishment to believe in its own superiority and to claim moral high grounds. It's no longer possible now, because we can see behind the curtain, and we can see that the Wizard of Oz is just an aging man playing a broken set of drums. I sincerely believe that they haven't moved on with it. They don't understand what's going on. They can't quite get their heads around the fact that they're losing credibility, and that the only way to regain it is to be trustworthy. And that means leaving the realm of propaganda and going back into the realm of news, of facts, and of trust. And building trust requires you to understand that the people who are listening to your news are intelligent enough to work out what is a lie and what is not, because of the technology that enables them to do so now.
I just want to read the statement that has just come in from the BBC, and then, Alan, I'll get you to react. So, clearly concerned about a cover-up, a BBC spokesperson has said, "The BBC is shocked to hear the details which have emerged in court today. There can be no place for such abhorrent behaviour, and our thoughts are with all those affected. The police have confirmed that the charges are not connected to the original complaint raised with the BBC in the summer of 2023. Nevertheless, in the interests of transparency, we think it is important to set out some points about events of the last year. In November 2023, while Mr. Edwards was suspended, the BBC, as his employer at the time, was made aware in confidence that he had been arrested on suspicion of serious offences and released on bail whilst the police continued their investigation. At the time, no charges had been brought against Mr. Edwards, and the BBC had also been made aware of significant risk to his health. Today, we have learnt the conclusion of the police process and the details as presented to the court. If at any point during the period Mr. Edwards was employed by the BBC, he had been charged, the BBC had determined it would act immediately to dismiss him. In the end, at the point of charge, he was no longer an employee of the BBC. During this period, in the usual way, the BBC has kept its corporate management of these issues separate from its independent editorial functions. We want to reiterate our shock at Mr. Edwards' actions, and our thoughts remain with all those affected. Now, Alan, I have two views on this, because firstly, I actually believe it's the right decision not to dismiss anyone until they are charged with a crime, because there has to be an assumption of innocence before proven guilty, and there has to be due process. But the problem you've got with the BBC here is that while it may not be related to this specific criminal case, they were warned about Huw Edwards' behaviour and they chose to take no action.
Yeah, I think the thing is, it is a judgment call, and I think that now you reflect on it and we can see that they were warned, there was some kind of recognition of it, and they chose a certain path. What I would say, if in good faith, I would say that, we really should be innocent until proven guilty. A lot of people throw around a lot of slurs until it's been established and clear, either through admission or better at a court with a judge or with peers of yours. Until that happens, we don't know exactly what's happened unless we've witnessed it. My much bigger concern with all of this is this sense that we, the great unwashed, need to be lectured and dictated to and told how to behave, and constantly presented not just with nudges but with direct shoves. Quite often it was not just not the lockdowns but more broadly, and that, I think, for the public is a very big concern.
And Alex Story, the thing is that then you have the likes of Emily Maitlis, Jon Sopel, David Yelland, Lewis Goodall, Owen Jones, the legacy media, the establishment media, who actually wanted to use the Huw Edwards story to curtail freedom of the press and to control social media. So am I right in assuming that they believe that as long as it's one of their mates, as long as it's a member of the establishment, there shouldn't be true and honest reporting on what they get up to?
Yeah, I mean, that's the double standard. When we come across it, we have to ring the alarm bells. It's something deeply flawed in our society. They are granting themselves, as I said before, this ability to judge others, and they, as Alan said before, they're not really concerned about due process when it's one of theirs. When they're going on the attack, anything is doable, because maybe the best way to understand this is that they see themselves in a state of war against the past because they're progressives. So anybody who has claims to the past, who likes his culture and history, is a Neanderthal, a reactionary. He needs to be defeated. If he can't be coaxed into moving into the progressive future, then everything is on the table. And this is the brutality that we see with them constantly. There is never any fine detail. It's always black and white. On the white side, you have them who see themselves as superior to us, and they always launch and they always attach the vilest motives to what we might be saying or what we might have done in the past. But when it comes to them, there's a lèse-majesté style of reaction. They believe that they're far superior to us, therefore they should be treated differently. And this is so deeply seated, obviously in the UK, but not just in the UK. We see that in other countries in Europe as well, and in the States. But that's the core, in my view, of the problem. They really believe that they're superior intellectually, culturally, socially, and everything else. We, as Alan said, are the great unwashed, and we don't deserve the time. For them, due process. For us, expediency.
Oh my goodness, you couldn't be more right. I mean, love that analysis. And in fact, fascinating that you use the phrase the great unwashed, because just last week, Mel Sykes, a major presenter at the BBC, revealed in a fascinating whistleblowing interview that BBC executives literally describe their audience, their license fee payers, their bosses as the great unwashed. So you couldn't be more spot on with that analysis. Alan Miller, can we ever trust anything the BBC says again? Because I'm sorry, I do not trust any of their reporters now, any of their journalists. As you rightly point out, they were propagandists for the government and for Big Pharma throughout the COVID crisis, and they got every single aspect of that story wrong. I think they were terrible when it came to reporting on Partygate, for example, which they tried to hype up in order to anti-democratically remove a prime minister from office. Can we ever trust the BBC's reporting again after all of this?
I think it's difficult to. I'm dubious about it. I firmly believe in the need for objectivity in reporting facts. Obviously, you can have opinion shows as well. I'm very concerned at the same time with the drive towards censorship, not just the Online Safety Act, but the Digital Services Act across Europe, and the constant attempt to limit and suffocate also the use of libel laws, which is often by the powerful to shut down others. And then using the courts to do that, when what we need is a full thrashing out of discussion. We saw it during Brexit. We've seen it consistently. We never seem to get an honest engagement with the public, a reflection of what people outside of London or Manchester might think. What about people in the coastal regions? What about across different parts of the country? It's infuriating, and it really reflects a kind of cavalier relationship to the truth. And when you have that situation, when you don't have standards and qualitative, investigative, rigorous approach that really lets you pursue the truth, regardless of, the implications, then that's very problematic. And I think that is the problem. Now, that does not mean we cannot have objective journalism, because I'm a firm believer that we must do. That it's not just that everything's relative and, you can have your truth, I have my truth. It is essential. There's some universal values and virtues and principles. There's common values that we need to subscribe to. And one of them is the truth, not many truths. But obviously, some of these things are complicated and sometimes people make mistakes. But the fact that you've got basically a propaganda organization at this point that is attempting to promote ideas that are very particular to the rest of the people who should know better is a real problem.
Yeah, indeed. And the person who was presenting those propaganda messages to us had child porn in his pocket, which is just a really horrifying thought. Now, another massive breaking story overnight. The Southport Massacre has now been turned by the MSM into a story about the quote-unquote far right. So I'll take you through what happened. Yesterday, we, of course, learned that there are 3 young victims of this knife man, the 17-year-old knife man, who has not been named. He may not be named, but we know while he was born in Cardiff, his parents are from Rwanda. This knife man stabbed 11 young girls at a Taylor Swift dance class. 3 died. The victims, 6-year-old BB King, 7-year-old Elsie Sancombe, and 9-year-old Alice Aguirre. Utterly heartbreaking, and a story that you would think would dominate the headlines for a long time. But there are serious questions that need to be asked about this man. Why did he commit this crime? And there have been lots of rumours that the information has been fed to us in some sort of nudge style. So we're not being told all the truth because they want to manage our emotions about what is a crime so deplorable that we simply cannot accept this type of thing happening anymore. So yesterday afternoon, the leader of Reform UK, the new MP for Clacton, Nigel Farage, released this video.
I know the Prime Minister went to lay flowers and was heckled, and it shows you how unhappy the public are with the state of law and order in our country. I have to say there are 1 or 2 questions. Was this guy being monitored by the security services? Some reports say he was, others less sure. The police say it's a non-terror incident, just as they said the stabbing of an Army Lieutenant Colonel in uniform on the streets of Kent the other day was a non-terror incident. I just wonder whether the truth is being withheld from us? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it is a fair and legitimate question. What I do know is something is going horribly wrong in our once beautiful country.
Now, I can't see anything wrong with what Nigel said there. Surely any politician or any journalist should be wanting those questions answered, given we have to know what caused that sort of terror on the streets of Southport. But last night, there were tensions on the street. We saw that earlier in the day. I showed you the clip yesterday. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, being heckled by furious locals who wanted to know how many more children would die. And then police apprehended this man who was apparently, and this has not been confirmed because we do not have the information from the police, but who was apparently carrying a machete.
Maybe.
Now, of course, the corrupt and dishonest mainstream media haven't reported the connection between that event and the indefensible violence against police, which then continued in Southport. Watch. Now, I need to be very clear on this. I understand the anger about what happened in Southport. You saw how much I felt it yesterday. But the anger, as I said in my digest yesterday, has to be harnessed responsibly. That is not responsible. And I am consistent when it comes to the police in this country. They do not always get things right. But at Manchester Airport, I believe they did. And it was so quick that the leftists and the mainstream media turned on them. So I will stand by the police in terms of their behaviour, both in Manchester and certainly in this case where they were very brave, the first responders dealing with the knife men. But what I cannot defend is the tone and the language from the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. And I'm going to show you here what Yvette Cooper said about the Muslim mob causing rampages in Rochdale compared to how she spoke about the mob on the streets of Southport last night. You will note the very clear difference in language and tone. Watch this.
Well, I've been talking to West Yorkshire police officers and also local community leaders about the action they're now taking in response to those unacceptable scenes of disorder and criminality that we saw last night. The community is working very closely together in response to what was a local child protection incident. But it's really important that the community can feel safe on the streets and also that the perpetrators feel the full force of the law.
Short time ago.
So appalling to now see those same police facing violent attacks from thugs on the streets who have no respect for a grieving community. It's a total disgrace. Frankly, this is a time when everyone should be showing respect for a community and for the police.
So let me bring Alan Miller and Alex Story, my superstar panel, back in now. And Alan, what feels very clear to me here is that the mainstream media and the political establishment are glad about what happened last night because it's the perfect distraction for them. They no longer have to talk about the stabbing of 11 girls at a Taylor Swift dance class because it's so much easier to be able to dismiss the far right as being responsible for all of the ills on the streets of Southport.
Yeah, I think it's very, very concerning that this country needs a very imminent, really serious open and honest discussion about the issues we face. We need to have a conversation about what's been going on with Hendon Police College, training police officers. We need to have a discussion about chief inspectors who are different to the guys on the front line, who often are put their own personnel into situations where they give them mixed messages, where they do not feel that they are supported, and they have to constantly do things in a different fashion with different groups. The obsession with DEI, with diversity, equality and inclusion, and what that means on the street. And also a situation where politicians are constantly presenting things in a certain way. And you've got the police often on the ground that put in very difficult circumstances, that have to go in. And we've seen this in a lot of instances in the last couple of weeks. It's ongoing, and it becomes very difficult for them. It's why so many people are leaving. They don't have enough resources. They feel that the public don't support them. The police should be there for the public, and the public for the police. And we've got a real issue that many in the public feel that, and I happen to agree with them at this juncture. There's a two-tier style of policing that's going on, that some of the demonstrations and protests where, for instance, actual terror prescribed organizations, people are waving their flags, people are chanting all sorts of things, people are vandalizing and damaging things, they get treated in one way. They're not coming down full force. We don't hear this kind of rhetoric. Whereas others who may not be doing any of those things, and certainly not prescribed terrorist organizations, and are conducting themselves calmly, are often treated in a very different way. And people are recognizing this. A lot of people are discussing it. And I think that what we've seen, both with the Home Office with Yvette Cooper, and also, let's be honest, our Prime Minister went up there and did not address the crowd. They were really, it seemed to me, they really wanted to hear some words from the Prime Minister, and he kind of scuffled off. And I think that that was a real mistake. But also, when Yvette Cooper chooses to describe one set of incidents in one way as a kind of community-based project, and then talks about thugs and the kind of visceral language that she uses there, so they've all been shipped in. We know a lot of the mainstream media were saying it was the EDL. They haven't existed for 10 years. It's this kind of trying to present the whole discussion a certain way. Meanwhile, this absolutely terrible tragedy and travesty has happened, where daughters have been killed. And I'm not surprised it's a febrile situation. I was impressed, Dan, by how dignified and composed everyone was earlier in the evening. Obviously, I don't know the circumstances. We haven't been released. We've seen that someone allegedly had a knife, and it was only 100 yards or so from the vigil. You know, that kind of situation is incendiary. Who is that person? What are they doing? These are all questions we don't know at the moment.
Yeah.
But even the policing of them and the way that's done and the engagement with them, a lot of people in Britain now, Dan, feel like they are being treated with contempt and disdain. They're either referred to as kind of gammon or kind of neo-Nazis, their grandparents that fought the actual Nazis. This whole idea that if you ask questions about borders or about migration or about
you're
lockdown,
racist, you're Islamophobic, you're transphobic.
Exactly. Rather than having, and this is what we really need, Dan, we need a really serious grown-up discussion in Britain with everyone engaged, where we can thrash out these issues, talk about them openly and honestly, because some people will try and leverage all this from different points of view. And those that, I mean, I certainly at Together, the reason we're called Together is that we think that we all have a much more common purpose together, that we as fellow citizens have a lot in common with one another. We have an ability to get back to sort of decent values of democracy, freedom, liberty and rights. And we may disagree about the role of the state and in the economy and everything, but ultimately we're fellow citizens. And this situation has the risk of really being even further exacerbated when people feel like they're constantly treated with disdain and contempt. And we need to get this back on track. And that means journalists taking themselves seriously, talking to people honestly and openly and objectively. That means elected representatives.
Well, I agree.
Also not treating the public with contempt.
I agree. But the problem is, Alex Story, that doesn't happen, because you see immediately a straw man argument being made today. The far right is now the problem. And look, the far right is now used to describe so many sorts of people, probably all three of us. at certain points have been described as the far right. It's almost becoming a meaningless term. But that's what the mainstream media has been dominated by today, Alex, not about how on earth 11 young girls were stabbed at a Taylor Swift dance class. And that's the problem I have. Also, Alex, if you look at Tommy Robinson, who is obviously the figure that the establishment most fear and want to shut down, he was very clear on X last night to his followers: do not throw bricks, do not engage in violence. There was certainly no encouraging of the criminal behaviour that went on in Southport, which we should all condemn.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the Tommy Robinson story is that he was arrested the day after having organised his, I suppose, from his perspective, very successful march. He was arrested under the Terrorism Act, which is odd. I spoke to lawyers about why that might be, and they said they have no idea. It's completely the wrong act to have arrested Tommy Robinson with. Now, the fact that he's been released unconditionally with unconditional bail is another story. But the interesting thing was that the police tweeted, "Yes, you read it right. We arrested Tommy Robinson the day after the march." And I think on this in Southport, what we have is quite the opposite. We have a blanket ban on trying to find out information, at least about the motive. Now, we've been told by an organization we don't trust that the chap is 17 years old. He could be 18, but given that officially he's 17, the law stops newspapers and organizations from releasing his name. But what they could have done is at least release the motive, giving people a sense that at least some of the truth could come out so that they could make sense of this tragedy. And this is the problem of the double standards we've been bumping our heads against since the beginning of the show. There are double standards. And I think the reason for this is because the state requires a growing population for growing GDP, otherwise it goes bankrupt. The reason we have to understand that there will never be an honest discussion about immigration is because the people of Britain are no longer reproducing. We are also covered with regulation, including the Climate Change Act from 2008, that has completely asphyxiated business in Britain, which essentially means that the FTSE in 2007 at its height was nearly at the same level as it is today. There's been no growth on the corporate sector since 2008. And if you include inflation into that, actually what you see is that Britain has impoverished itself massively. So in order to keep the books balanced, Britain needs more population. And the only way to get the GDP numbers up so that we don't go bankrupt is through population growth, because there'll not be productivity growth because of regulation. And that means open borders is the only way to keep our civil servants paid with currency that has any value. That's the reason why there will never be an honest discussion about immigration. And the collateral damage is worth the price of all those people who work in the civil service, whose pay is determined by GDP growth numbers. That's it. And that's the thing that we've got to face.
Indeed it is. Now, I just want to show you one more thing. A couple of weeks ago, Andrew Marr, another one of those journalists who we were told was impartial when he was the main presenter on the BBC for years and years and years of politics, although has since admitted, since he's gone to the private sector, that actually he's as hard left as they come. But you remember, a few weeks ago, he went on Question Time and predicted that Labour was going to usher in this utopia under slippery stone. Watch this.
Well, a couple of sources of optimism, because I completely agree with the questionnaire. We have to be optimistic looking forward. I think just having a stable government that will be there for 5, maybe 10 years, who knows, but with sort of ordinary, down-to-earth, serious people talking like the rest of us in charge of the government, and a plan that doesn't shift very much for investment, is going to mean a wall of money coming into this country from around the world. You look at the chaos going on the continent, particularly in France. You look at the chaos likely ahead in the United States. And suddenly, for once, for the first time in many of our lives, actually Britain looks like a little haven of peace and stability. And that...
Look at what has happened since Labour has come to power. Alan, you've had riots in Hare Hills, issues with the police. You've had Bangladeshis take over police stations in East London. I mean, I could go on and on and on. This is not going to be utopia under Labour, is it?
You know what's so astonishing about that speech is the way Andrew talks about people that are serious and who talk like the rest of us. They talk like him, and they're a very small group of people that are basically now intertwined. And I must say that it's very little to differentiate most of them. They've all attended Russell Universities, many Oxbridge. They have no relationship with the public, with the demos of any real meaning. They treat us often with disdain and contempt because they're not actually held accountable and responsible. There's a huge gap between them and us. Labour, the very name Labour, they no longer have an association with it. They're rudderless, and instead of taken on board all of these new ideological kind of, people call them woke, but identitarian positions that are not about the real concerns of everyday people, but they've been hoisted upon us. And the idea, and this is to refer to what Alex was saying, which was very interesting, the idea that now is going to usher in a new period, a bit like he's hoping like the Blair Cameron period economically, it seems like that's what he means, is preposterous. We've got an enormous issue with productivity, with sluggish growth. We need to address that issue, and not by bringing lots more people in for cheap labour, but by actually reinvesting, by allowing zombie companies to fail, by having a 50-year plan for infrastructure, by being honest with the public and getting the public engaged in a manifesto and in an outlook and an orientation. Whilst we let companies fail and let people lose jobs, we do retraining. At the moment, 5 million people are not working in Britain. We have to address the issue of benefits versus low wages. None of this is really being taken on board. And the idea that this is a serious new lot of sensible people, I just think that reflects the bubble that Andrew's in, unfortunately.
Yeah. Very good point. Alan Miller, co-founder of the Together Declaration, and the Conservative commentator Alex Story. Alex, you get back to your holiday now. I'm very sorry to have disturbed it, but what a brilliant superstar panel. The best analysis that you certainly don't get in the mainstream media. Now, Father Calvin Robinson is coming up. We're going to have much more on the Southport story, plus what went on in Southend last night. What on earth is happening to lawless Britain? Father Calvin Robinson up in just 1 minute. But you know I've promised on this show to only talk to you about products that are actually life-changing. This one is a little bit more personal, but the fellas watching, you're going to completely get it. And I have to tell you, ladies, this is the best possible treat for your husband or boyfriend, because it really is a game changer. So you know us men want our grooming routine to be a one and done deal. Well, the days of using the same trimmer for your face and your privates are over, thanks to our friends at the brilliant Manscaped. They've come up with the ultimate package to keep your hairs trimmed from 12 to 6. Introducing the Beard and Balls bundle, featuring the Lawnmower 5.0 and the Beard Hedger. And despite what it sounds like, I'm not actually talking about a real lawnmower, like that sort of lawnmower, but this is a lawnmower that will trim your sensitive areas and actually get them as manicured as fresh cut grass. So this trimmer gets right the first time. It's gentle on the skin in all of the right places, and with 2 interchangeable skin-safe blade heads, you can choose between a precise trim or a smooth finish. And did I mention it's waterproof? You can trim in the shower and avoid making a mess everywhere. Perfect for those of us who appreciate efficiency. Next, I want to tell you about the Beard Hedge. Now, this is great whether you're going for a neat stubble. I think I've got a neat stubble look today, actually, or a full-on lumberjack. The trimmer has you covered because it has 20 length options, meaning you can achieve any style with a titanium-coated stainless steel T-blade. Just like the lawnmower, the beard hedger is also waterproof, so you can handle your beard grooming right in the sink or shower without worrying about water damage. And with up to 60 minutes of runtime and an LED charge indicator, you'll never be caught mid-trim with a dead battery. I love this product. I use it all the time. It will keep you very happy. And if you're looking for a treat for your boyfriend or husband, it will keep them very happy too. And the great news is, I've got a proper offer for you today. 20% off and free shipping. You just have to use the code Outspoken at manscaped.com. No more juggling multiple tools or dealing with subpar results, just efficient, effective grooming wherever you need it. I'm going to put the link in our YouTube description, but I'll repeat it again. Manscaped.com. Use the code Outspoken when you check out. For the premium grooming experience, trust Manscaped. But now, back to the show. And it's time for today's Outsider, Father Calvin Robinson. Father Calvin, what a day of news. And we're going to be covering it all with you now, but also in our uncancelled after show as well. But let's start with Southport, Calvin, because what do you make of the fact that the mainstream media and political establishment seemingly have embraced the fact that they no longer have to talk about 11 young girls being stabbed on Monday because they are obsessed with the so-called far-right protesters?
It's very convenient, isn't it, Dan? Alice, Elsie and Bibi are at the back of the mainstream media's minds now because they can talk about something else. They can distract us with division further. Yes, there was some problems yesterday in Southport, but of course, other than that, there were vigils, there were prayers, there were people giving memories and talking about the families that they'd known and loved. And these three girls, but not only these three girls, there are of course 5 others still majorly injured, and we're praying for their full recovery too. But of course, the mainstream media and the politicians want to keep talking about any trouble they see. And this is why anyone that's going to Southport to support the families and support the community has to make sure they go there peacefully. We should be angry. Absolutely, we should be angry. We should be in righteous indignation at the horror that has taken part there. But we cannot meet that anger with violence. The moment we submit to violence, we become slaves to that sin. And of course, we distract everyone from Alice, Bibi, and Elsie, and the other girls. And so we've got to bring it back to truth, goodness, and beauty. We've got to bring it back to prayer. We've got to bring it back to helping that community, because this community, from next week onwards, they're going to be left behind as other incidents happen and other news stories come up. So we've got to make sure that they're taken care of and they're prayed for and they're looked after.
Yeah, and actually it's frustrating because we need to have a national conversation about why this violence is happening on the streets of the UK, why our children are not safe at a Taylor Swift dance class. And I do not shy away from the discussion that I had with Laurence Fox on Monday, or my digest yesterday, where I spoke about the failure of assimilation, the failure of multiculturalism. But the problem is, Calvin, that's an intellectual discussion, and the protests last night, which turned violent, just mean you've given the mainstream media what they want: diversion. They do not want to talk about the fundamental issues.
No, and even when they do talk about it, they play distraction techniques then. So they'll say, well, actually, the perpetrator was British because he was born here, and actually he was raised there from 6 years old or whatever. Avoiding the fact that this was not an Anglo-Saxon Brit, this was not a white Brit, this was someone who was recently brought into this country or born in this country, it doesn't matter, but not from this country. And that's the conversation we need to be having. Why is it that there are so many communities that are not integrating? There are so many people that are not assimilating. And when they're not, this multicultural bubble keeps exploding and people are getting hurt. We have to decide what kind of nation we want to be. If we are going to take people in from other places, should we look at what values they come with? There are many Christians who are being persecuted in southern Sudan, northern Nigeria, Artsakh, China even. If we want to help people who are genuine refugees, perhaps they're places to start, rather than looking at communities that hate us, hate our way of life, and want to do us harm.
Yes, although I should stress, Calvin, because this guy is 17 years old, we actually still don't know what his religious beliefs are, although the police do seem to be briefing the BBC that he has no connection to Islam. But
Look,
I want to
the
see that
police
for
and
myself.
the
I
media-
want to know. I want to know for certain.
They're not going to tell us about him. What they'll keep doing is they'll talk about the protests, or they'll talk about any trouble that pops up. And when they're not talking about that, they may even talk about those poor girls, and they'll talk about their families and their lives. They'll do anything to avoid talking about the perpetrators. We need to know who these people are, where they came from, and what motivated them. So often these attacks in the public, they hide the motivations. We never get the manifestos. We never get the reasons. And it's actually dangerous because we don't know who the people are that want to kill us.
Totally. But the problem is, Calvin, it wasn't just in Southport where there was trouble last night. I want to show you some of this footage from Southend, which should be the archetypal British English summer destination, totally safe for families, but in an indication of the sort of law and order crisis, the loss of control happening up and down the country. Look at what happened on the streets of Southend last night. And Calvin, that had been sparked by quite an astonishing machete fight, which we can take a look at now, Calvin. So, Calvin, you've got the backdrop of the quintessential British fairground playing host to the sort of machete violence that we just shouldn't be seeing on the streets of the UK.
And I'm mourning for the loss of our country. I really do. This is so sad to see. This is something you'd expect to see in the third world, but people keep saying import the third world, become the third world. We're seeing it played out in action. In that, I'm sure I counted 4 police officers. I think there were police officers in that video on the periphery. What were they doing? Of course, they're scared. They're afraid. Of course, they're afraid. They should be afraid, but they should be trained to deal with these situations and to take these people off the streets. We're seeing machetes as increasingly in these situations. And actually, it doesn't matter what sparked the situation. Much like, was it just over a week ago in Leeds, when apparently a Romani gypsy child was taken off the family by the social services and the Mohammedan community started rioting, or in Whitechapel in London when someone was arrested by police in Bangladesh, and so black Bangladeshis in London started rioting. It actually doesn't matter what's sparking, igniting these troubles. These troubles are increasing across the country because people are unhappy. There is a growing civil unrest. This country is not a safe place anymore because people don't feel at home. There's divisiveness everywhere. There's different communities, hostile ends of, Southport and Southend, opposite ends of the country. What is going on?
Calvin, let's have a couple of pieces of fun, sort of minor light relief on a tough news day. I loved this moment from LBC, which I now describe as the Labour Broadcasting Company. So you've got Carol Vorderman, hard left deranged lunatic, filling in for James O'Brien, hard left deranged lunatic. And you remember, Calvin, for the past few months, Vorders has been on a relentless drive to get the Labour government elected, who she believed would come in and herald some sort of socialist takeover of Britain and everyone would be happy. Well, during the course of one phone call with a devastated pensioner, you can see the colour drain from her face as she realises it simply isn't going to happen.
I am incandescent about it. I couldn't have believed that a Labour government would have ever done anything so iniquitous.
Oh, we'll just see if we can get sound on that clip. But while we do, Calvin, I also want to ask you about Sam Smith and the BBC playing into this this sort of ludicrous butchering of our English language by running a headline about Sam Smith becoming or getting a portrait of himself at the National Portrait Gallery, but it says Sam Smith has said it was an honour to have a painting of them unveiled at the National Portrait Gallery in central London. Now, Calvin, this is the BBC. This is the national broadcaster. So are we now just accepting that the English language is going to be butchered and that they is going to be used as a plural? Because I cannot deal with it.
I'm still stuck on the idea that Sam Smith has a portrait for him in the National Portrait Gallery. What's that about? Bless him. No, we're not going to admit defeat. The BBC can flirt with the rules of the English language as much as they want, but the rest of us will uphold those standards. Sam Smith is a bloke. He is a man. He, him. No they, them. That doesn't exist. We don't have this plurality of persons in the English language. We have to just keep using the language as we've always known it, as we know it to be true. And if people like the BBC want to doctor that, then we have to turn off the BBC and hashtag defund the BBC. They do not speak on our behalf.
No, indeed. And we're going to talk much more about the British Bashing Corporation and the Huw Edwards scandal in our after show. Just checking, do we have that Carol Vorderman clip with sound? No, we'll try and get it for you later, Calvin. But do stand by, because as I say, Father Calvin isn't going anywhere. It's very important to me that we have a safe space not patrolled by big tech, where censorship and control run deep. So that's why we have www.outspoken live, our membership section, where you get half an hour of extra content every single day. So what we do at this stage is we come off YouTube, we come off Rumble, we move to our own platform for the rest of our discussion with Father Calvin. Lots to discuss. What's his take on this shocking Huw Edwards story? And also, why on earth does an extreme Islam sect want to buy an entire island in Scotland to practice Sharia law? This is the madness that we're entering into, folks, under Labour. All you have to do is sign up right now at www.outspoken.live. Remember, we are back every weekday at 5 p.m. UK time, midday Eastern time, 9 a.m. Pacific. Do hit subscribe right now on YouTube and Rumble. And most importantly, I promise to keep on fighting for you. See you on the after show with much more from Father Calvin Robinson.